Hello and welcome to this online event hosted by the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors and presented by the Association of Canadian Ergonomists. So, human error, consider human factors and ergonomics. Now, have you ever wished that your organisation spent far less time looking for human culprits when errors are made, but actually far more time investing in well-designed equipment and processes which can be used intuitively and safely, and thereby supporting people to do the greatest work they can do and be the best they can be? Well, if you have, you're certainly in the right place. And over the next 90 minutes or so, we'll be hearing from Jeanne, from Heather, from Danielle and Jane on the topic of human error. And I, for one, I'm very much looking forward to it. Okay, just to give you some idea of how this all works, we'll be together for around about an hour and a half, maybe a bit more if things are developing well. So it'll be around about an hour and a half or so. You can enter questions and comments in the chat box that you see in the bottom right of your screen. So you can say hello to each other, post comments and pop in questions. If you do put a question in, can I ask you, if you will, to preface it with Q:. That helps us pick out questions from comments and other bits and pieces. That's very helpful and will help us and our chair to get to your questions as best we can. Now, if you do have a problem with sound or vision during this event, and we hope you don't, but we do rely on the internet to make all this work for us, and it's a particularly busy time right now for the internet, then please firstly check that you're not using Microsoft Edge or Internet Explorer, and if you are, please leave the room, use the original link and come back using a different browser. Please also, of course, check that your connection, whether that's a wired or wireless internet connection or a 4 or 5G connection, is working. You might want to refresh your device to make sure that that's the case. Otherwise, if there's a general issue that affects all of us, then I'll get onto it as quickly as I can and I'll let you know in chat how I'm getting on. So keep an eye on that. But otherwise, I hope we can experience a trouble-free event and we can all enjoy that together. Okay, that's about all you need to know from me, I think. It's now my pleasure to introduce your chair for the day, Jeanne Garang. Jeanne.
So today we will be introducing the topic of human factors from the point of view of I'm going to introduce the topic of human errors through the point of view of human factors. We're going to talk about workplace system, transportation and technologies, and very importantly, we will share practical principles for preventing human errors. So Ergo at Large is a subcommittee of ACE, the Association of Canadian Ergonomists. The committee is comprised of professors, researchers, consultants, students, practitioners. So we encourage collaboration between all disciplines who care about human activities, safety, well-being, and performance of people. So let me introduce you now to our three speakers today. So the first person who's gonna talk is Heather Cayley. She's a human factors specialist from British Columbia in Canada. So we will be speaking about management aspects of errors. Then Danielle Lemay, a certified ergonomist from Alberta, will talk about physical aspects of human errors. And James Lee, owner and founder of OPC, as well as an ergonomics consultant, will explain the aspects of human errors from a cognitive point of view. So please enjoy, and over to you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Jean. And hello, and a very warm welcome to everybody joining us online today. So I'd like to begin with an overview of ergonomics. It's, as Jean said, the foundation of today's webinar on error. So ergonomics, or human factors, it's a scientific discipline. It's concerned with understanding interactions among people and other elements of a system. It's also a profession that applies the understanding of these principles, data, and methods to design the system to optimize human well-being and overall system performance. The terms ergonomics and human factors are used often interchangeably or as a unit. So within human factors ergonomics, there are three broad domains of research shown on your screen: organizational, physical, and cognitive. They're shown in the graphic as being discrete, but they are not. They overlap. Aspects of organizational management influence both the physical as well as the cognitive domains, and so on. For our discussion today, each of us will be providing information and examples from these three areas, and I'll begin with organizational aspects and influences on other parts of the system. But you've now heard me mention system a few times, so let's begin with that. Simply stated, a system comprises two or more parts that work together to achieve a common goal. We ourselves are biological systems comprised of heart, brain, pancreas, etc., and we interact with many systems every day: our phone, computers, vehicles, and many others. So looking at the photograph on the left showing work being performed, some parts of the system are visible: a portion of the facilities, the tool being used, the personal protective equipment being worn, the worker, his posture, lighting, etc. But some parts are invisible. Other parts of the facility, management practices, perhaps the work order, co-workers, are noticeably absent. Key takeaway, though, is that although invisible, especially in this picture, other parts may also influence the outcome just as much as the visible ones. So to understand error and its effects, wanted or unwanted, we have to look at the whole workplace system and not just the visible, obvious, or individual parts. So with that, moving to the figure on the right, this figure illustrates a workplace system. It's comprised of three interrelated elements: the facilities, where the work happens. It can be the forest, the water, or the roads, and includes things like tools, equipment, etc. It includes also the people who do the work, and the management system, those responsible for organizing, directing the work, and have a great influence over the system. So systems are dynamic. That meaning they're constantly changing. They're interactive, meaning parts interact with other parts of the system. They're organized with structure and order, and their components act in nonlinear ways. As a system is a product of their interactions. So to borrow an analogy from Dr. Russell Ackoff, a renowned researcher on systems thinking, let's consider the car as an example to clarify. So no individual part of the car can move on its own. Not the wheel, the axle, the seat, or even the motor, but a car can. If you take apart a car, you have just the pieces. The function of the system is not found in its constituent parts, but rather working together as a whole. Systems are indivisible, meaning they can't be decomposed, reduced, or pulled apart. Addressing one component on its own or separately would be ineffective. So the key takeaway is that we must examine component behavior in the context of the whole. So in a system where you have workplace facilities, people, and the management system interacting, we accomplish successfully work, safety, and goals. However, at the same time and at the intersection of these elements shown here by the shaded area, work is performed and success is achieved, but errors and unwanted events can also emerge. Where elements overlap, mismatches can develop. And where gaps or mismatches develop, there's potential for human error. Understanding how and why errors occur and ultimately preventing them requires looking inside the system, In today's session, we're going to do just that, provide an inside perspective of the system, drawing on some examples of technology and transportation. Error, like work, is produced or found in a system through the interaction of its component parts. We've likely all made errors even today. Forgot something, skipped a step, sent an email to the wrong person. Many errors are inconsequential, being a minor inconvenience, but others, as we know, throughout history have had disastrous outcomes. The term dates back to the 1300s, meaning a departure from staying on the correct path. And it's often a label that is applied in hindsight or after the fact. Often those who determine if an error has even been made were not in the same situation. Some of the information and often the outcome may be known, but not a full understanding of the circumstances or the situation that led to or allowed the error. People act locally. They take action given their focus, their knowledge, resources, training, line of sight, experience, goals, believing it made sense. Otherwise, they wouldn't do it. This is called the local rationality principle. So the goal is to understand the context, the work conditions, and the influences at the time of the error, the time that it was made. Once considered a neat and simplistic answer to failure, increasingly, now its simplicity is being challenged. So on the one hand, on the left-hand side of your screen, error is often seen as the answer, even a conclusion. A zoom lens is used to focus in exclusively on the person who made the error. Human error is pronounced as the cause and an explanation for incidents, and sadly, a stopping point for many investigations. Complex systems are believed safe, rules a guarantee of safety. And underpinning this view are efforts that if you just pay attention, try harder, or remove the people, then we'll be free from errors. On the right-hand side, a different perspective applied by human factors ergonomics uses a wide-angle lens for a broader view of the system. Underpinning this perspective are the tenets that the system isn't automatically safe. Error is a symptom of deeper trouble. People are trying their best to reconcile goals given their limited time and resources, and at a minimum, error is just a starting point. So which lens are you using? Do you find your current lens is zooming in on individual components or looking at just the error itself? Which lens affords learning about the broader contributory factors for effective prevention? So where organizational management interacts with the workplace facilities and the people, we have, as we said, the potential for error to emerge. Remembering the photograph shown earlier, it's easy to become preoccupied with the discrete, visible components of the system, such as typically operator actions, personal protective gear, or tools. But equally important is the role and the influence the organizational management has, which can increase or reduce the potential for error. So some examples of practices and processes influenced by organizational management are listed on your screen. They could include things like production levels, which might be in turn influenced by staffing levels, pace, and incentive, etc. So to eliminate and reduce the potential for error and to learn from error, there is a shift happening, a shift towards using the wide-angle lens, focusing on the whole system, as I've described, where work takes place, zooming out, recognizing and accepting the contribution of the elements of the whole system, and when they overlap, sometimes the emergence of error. So in this table, we've assembled 12 principles for eliminating and reducing error, aiming, as James Reason would say, to drain the swamp rather than swat at mosquitoes. Each row is representing a different workplace component, showing its influence over these principles. But as I've said before, they're not discrete. They overlap and they apply across the whole system. For example, when safety critical processes rely heavily on memory, anticipating error can drive changes both at the workplace and reduce memory load for the worker. Developing and implementing purchasing standards with a more human-centric set of criteria may begin with the management level, but influences the workplace and people. Promoting reporting, the reporting of errors without reprisal. I recall an example that I read about where an employer got really creative and was offering a reward for the error that produced the highest degree of learning. So I've highlighted these 7 principles that the organizational management has influence over. But arguably, as the arrows indicate, all the principles are applicable and beneficial across the whole workplace system. So I'd like to illustrate with an example, and let's dive into this workplace. So a worker was mixing chemicals to make a lacquer. The worker tipped the steel barrel, and while pouring the toluene into the vat, a static discharge was produced, causing the vapor to ignite. The worker had forgotten to attach the grounding clamps. A steel foreplate was in place years earlier following a similar event designed to eliminate the buildup of a static charge. However, cardboard was placed on the floor to provide traction when manually maneuvering the barrels, which in turn did 2 things: eliminated the passive ground and created the need to remember to apply the grounding cables. Knowing error emerges from the interaction of workplace components is vital. We have to look at all the system components and not simply the actions of those who touch the system last. In this case, consider the potential for error when safety critical processes are heavily relying on memory, or the requirement to move heavy barrels without assistance, or looking at previous incidents and the options for reporting and learning. So despite decades of work by many, provided in the resource section of this presentation, explaining system interactions that create work and sometimes error, still, human error is often cited as the sole cause of most incidents. The media headlines following this Humboldt bus crash claim the driver made a mistake, a very big mistake. Let's take a look. Like the previous example, we'll look at the workplace system components and context, and we won't be discussing corrective measures. So a truck driver held a driving job for just 1 month, but had not driven for more than 2 weeks, departed on his first solo trip on April 5th. He held a license from a private provider. The Alberta-based company supplied the driver with a commercial flatbed truck, having 2 trailers, making in excess of 25 meters long. The driver left his home in Alberta in the early morning hours to pick up a load of peat moss. Sometime later, the driver lost his way. Trying to find his way, he turned around and became stuck in the mud on the shoulder. Later, he asked a farmer for directions. Finally, back en route, traveling westbound, this is westbound here, he was traveling westbound on Highway 335. Just before 5 o'clock, peering into his rearview mirror, he realized his tarp had become loose and was flapping in the wind, and this creates the potential to potentially lose some of the peat moss bundles. So looking in his side view mirror at the load, the driver didn't see the stop sign or the flashing light on the shoulder of the road. The truck continued through the intersection of highways 335 and north-southbound Highway 35. At the same time, a chartered bus carrying 29 passengers was traveling northbound, and there isn't a stop sign on Highway 35. Due to the standing grove of trees to the east, the bus driver was unable to see the approaching transport truck. And when the bus driver finally did see the truck, he did apply the brakes, but it was too late to stop in time. Human error splashed across the headlines as an explanation, revealing an incomplete and inaccurate picture. But sadly, that's what many will only hear or see about this story. Yet, dating back to the 1940s, it's recognized and understood errors are a function of the design of the system in which they were made or permitted to happen. Operator actions and decisions are embedded in and a result of the workplace system influences. In the workplace system, organizational management has responsibility and influence over many aspects as I've described. So things that could include are like safety protocols and work aspects. So things like processes to report and act on issues, hiring, orientation, training, education, but also work aspects like the vehicles themselves, the fleet, the selection of the vehicles, upkeep, load securement, transport, scheduling, wayfinding, and many, many more. So to restate, it's vital to look at all the system components in context, not simply the actions of those who perform the work at the sharp end. And with that, I will leave you with this quote. People don't operate in a vacuum where they can decide and act all powerfully. It's not a choice to make an error. Instead, our work is constrained by many factors, and we're trying to do the best we can. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Danielle.
Thank you very much, Heather. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today to have the opportunity to talk to you more about human factors and ergonomics in the context of error. And just before I start, I want to apologize for my voice. It's not a good timing to wake up with a sore throat. So yeah, just to mention that. So what I'd like to first talk about is just let's look at how the workplace plays a role into human error that we would call. So Heather covered the organizational piece of it, but let's think about the physical workplace, how it has an impact on the way we perform the task. So let's just think about the facility layout or even the workstation layout. The way it's been designed will impact the way we're going to perform the task. Or is there any feedback with signs, labels, or even signals that will inform the employees that he might be in the right direction or in the wrong direction with the work that has been performed? It can be either the machine interface as well. So there's really a lot of variability in the physical workplace that will positively or negatively influence the way we do our work. So let's have a look at the principles that Heather just introduced with the tables. So in the workplace, which is the blue sections, there's 5 principles who specifically apply to the workplace. So to come back with the feedback that I just mentioned, so the workplace providing feedback to the employees, or how the context can also have an impact on the way we are doing our task. So lighting, noise, temperature, cadence, etc. So there's many different elements in the context. Complexity. It's really important to make sure that the environment will reduce as much as possible the complexity from a physical perspective, but also from a cognitive. It's not just black or white. I mean, as it's been introduced before, all these 3 elements interact together. So here, yeah, physical and cognitive, definitely. It's also important to make sure that incident can be reported. So yes, the management has this accountability in terms of putting a system in place and encouraging people to report it. But as an employees, it's important to have in place and easily accessible tools, like it can be paper version of, or if it's an IT system, it needs to be easily accessible as well for them to report near miss, maybe dangerous condition, and obviously incident when they happened. And lastly, it's important to protect known risk from the employees, so they cannot reach them with safeguards, interlocks, etc. So in the coming slides, I will provide specific examples for all those 5 principles. But before moving to this, I would like to briefly explain the different error-proof design levels. So there's different levels, and the level 1 being the strangest one, where it completely prevents the incident from occurring. It cannot happen because the way it's been designed. So let's look at the example on the right side of the tables, we can see that the road has been designed in a way that the bus on the road cannot come in conflict, I would say, with the rail, with the train. So the collision can never happen with this design. Level 2 is more of an administrative type of controls. So the error can be detected as long as the person is paying attention. But in these examples, we can see that there's a physical barrier going up or down. There's also flashing lights, and I guess there's audible signal as well. So it will detect in advance that there's a potential risk ahead of you. And the last one, which is the weakest design level, doesn't allow necessarily, it doesn't prevent. It can happen as long, again, as the person is paying attention. So there's simply a sign saying that there's a rail, so not even knowing if there's a train or not. So yeah, there's no flashing light or something, any input saying to the people on the road that there's a train coming, but there might have one. So those are the 3 levels. And there's 2 examples in the next slide that will cover 2 out of the 5 principles. So I'd like to talk about pokayoke. Maybe you've ever heard about it, maybe not. So what a pokayoke is, it's a Japanese expression that is part of a lean manufacturing tool. So pokayoke just allow a one-way assembly. So it provides immediate feedback to the worker if they are doing the right thing or not. If it's not the right thing, it won't fit in it. So with this example, there's, let's say, a plug. So if you try to put it in an electrical outlet and that's not the right one, it won't fit. So it prevents the mistake to happen. Whereas when that's the right assembly to do, it's gonna work. So that's a level 1 error-proof design. And then on the other hand, on the right side of we can see a picture of an interlocks. So there's a robot behind the fence, and robots are known for the risk they can incur in the workplace. So there's regulation around it, and one of it requires to have safeguards. So this interlocks basically when the door is shut and the robot is activated, the door cannot be open. As soon as the door gets open, the programming of the system will stop the robot. So it will never work. So that's how it becomes a level 1 design levels. And if we talk now about the workplace context, I thought it could be interesting to show you a real example close to me, where a childhood friend of mine lost his life many years ago in a work accident. It was in the pulp and paper industry with a similar machine than the one that you can see on the screen. Not exactly this one, but yeah, just to show you how it looks like, how big these machines are when they produce paper. So the context in this situation played an important role. And just let's look at the element. It can be noise, lighting, we see temperature, there's many different things. But in this specific example, there was a paper jam that happens, meaning that someone needs to go on the machine and fix the paper jam. And we can refer on that picture of the blue, the kind of light blue paper. So that goes into the roll. So there was a paper jam there. So my friend went to fix it. And of course, he was working as a team with someone else. And since it's such a vast area, it's a vast local, it's really noisy. And they could not have a visual communication together. So in this context, the other guy thought that my friend says, okay, you can start the machine. But he never said that because it was too noisy. They couldn't hear each other's properly. So what happened is that there was pinch points that were unprotected. So typically we need to protect in running nip point, but it was not protected. So his foot was there when the other guy started the machine. And then the accident happened. But just in this context, it's to highlight how the noise plays a big role in how the distance and not having visual communications will also have an impact. And lastly, with following up with the principles, how to reduce complexity. Here it's just a simple example of two different control panels. So on the left side, we can see mechanical keys on the control panel. So regardless of the size of your fingers, we will all receive a tactile feedback to know if we are touching the keys properly or not, and if it's the right one. Versus if we look on the right side of the slides, we can see a touch screen where we can easily click on the wrong buttons without even knowing. So an easy way to alleviate it would be to use a stylish, let's say, that has a fine tips, so it will help to be more precise. So this is an example of physical complexity, but it could also be cognitive. Just let's think about, again, displays. When the control panel, one can be simple, the other one can be complex and induce mistakes. Or when we navigate on a website, sometimes it's intuitive, sometimes it is not. And to come back with the Humboldt bus crash that has been introduced by Heather, I'd like to bring up the workplace perspective of that incident. So let's look at the picture. We can see really pretty well that on the forward side, right side of the pictures, that's the direction of the truck driver. So this person was driving towards the left, which is west. And then the bus was coming from the bottom of the picture, so coming from south going up north. And we can easily see the stand of trees that are obstructing the view for both drivers, so they cannot see in those directions. Heather highlighted the fact that, yes, there was a stop sign with red light flashing, but the truck driver was distracted by the flapping tarp. So that's one thing. But let's look at its equipment first. Hopefully it's going to help my voice. So when we think about the truck itself, which is a component of the workplace in these situations, it was a semi-trailer like the one that we can see on the picture on the left. However, the trailers attached to it were not the same. It was two commercial flatbeds, meaning that, yeah, they are really flat. And there was peat moss into it, which is a really light material that isn't easy to secure manually. So that's why it added some challenges, I would say, not having been provided with the right equipment in this situation. So that's why probably it was flapping, because it's been done all manually. The truck was exceeding by 25 meters because there was two trailers, not just one. And the weight has been estimated to up to 65 metric tons. Which is really heavy, and apparently this type of truck is not easy to maneuver. So this is more about the equipment, but let's have a look at the road design itself and how it can have plays a role as well in the occurrence of that event. So typically shoulders on the road should be larger when you approach to an intersections. In this case, we can see that it's pretty narrow, and that's the truck driver vision that we have currently. So this picture is facing west. We can also notice that there's the trees on the left, so they could not see each drivers could not see each other's because of the location of the trees. That wouldn't have been there either if the shoulder would have been wider. So, but let's look at the road. When we focus our attention on that road, we can see that first there's some glare. So sunrise and sunset are well known for glare. I would say when we drive east and west. but even more, I would say, on the wet days and sunny days. But there was also the way it's been designed has been identified as fostering, I would say, a tunnel visions. When we look at the road, because of the power poles locations on the side of the road, the electrical, all the lights as well, and the horizon creates naturally a tunnel visions that bring the view to go further on the road, further west, and it's amplified by the sun during these days. So it has also been identified as a potential element, in fact, in this situation. Plus, yes, we can see that there's a stop sign on the right side of the road, but it looks dark because of the environment. It's really glaring in those conditions. Plus, the person was distracted looking in the mirror to look behind at the load to make sure that he's not losing the load. So this covers basically, I would say, the physical workplace environment in this situation, and Jane will cover the people aspect of it. But just before turning the mic to Jane, I'd like to finish with a quote that has been told by James Reason, who says that we cannot change the human conditions, but we can change the condition under which humans work. And on this quote, I will pass it over to my colleague, Jane Sleet. Thank you. I guess Jane might have some technical issues to be heard.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, parfait. Okay, so what I want to do is actually talk about the human side of human error, and whether it's an employee or a designer, ergonomists, etc. And we have a mixed audience. So what I want to do is actually start with just a basic definition in terms of cognition, because I find that the terms mental demands, cognitions, emotion, those things tend to be used interchangeably when in fact they're very distinct, especially when it comes to neurophysiology and the human brain, and how the human brain works in the context of design and the workplace. So what happens with the brain if we're at work, for example, or designing a product, is that there's a situation, we have automatic thoughts that occur, and the thoughts are actually cognition, and then there's a reaction. And the reactions are emotional. So there may be a situation in the workplace where there's suddenly a lot of distress, so stressful reaction to this. There's the actual behavior, so someone actually does something, I flip a switch, I forget to turn my mic on, just like in this situation, and then also a physiological response. So I may have increased heart rate, respiratory rate. I may, my cognition may become clouded, not as clear, and I'm not able to work through the mental demands of an actual task. So I just wanted to clarify some of that when talking about the actual human being themselves. So what I'm focusing on is sources of error. And what I often do is when I'm talking to designers, now those designers may be interior designers, architects, engineers, product designers, software, etc. One of the things that I tell them in order to try to get the point across, and it's not meant literally, but it's really to try to to hit home with this is that there really isn't human error. It's the error in the design. And the reason why I say that is I try to make the point very strongly, but I also want people to look at the root cause before always pointing to human error. So no matter what, historically, it's always been, well, it's the employee. We need to let that employee go. They made that mistake. And that's done in the absence of actually looking at what are the root causes for an actual error, an accident to occur. So people, so it might be their education, what sort of training and skills they have, body size, so anthropometrics, their communication, what sort of communication, their actual skills. Are they fatigued? Did they have something happen within their family, some sort of family emergency the day before, and so they're coming into the workplace not being fully mentally alert, etc. And through COVID in particular, where there's have been a lot of substance abuse and mental health issues, are we actually seeing employees at their best in terms of mentally and their cognitive abilities? So we need to really look at that, and memory as well, their working memories, what sort of training and education that they've been provided. So coming back to this chart, just to emphasize the people part of it and knowing that all of this is interrelated, we've broken it down into these levels, but we know that the creation of an error resulting in some sort of a near miss or an accident can actually, it's all of these things together. But when it comes to people, and I think it's Gordon that actually asked this, and I'm glad he brought this up in the notes here, is that reporting of errors. One of the critical thing that we find within the workplace is, are employees actually encouraged on a bona fide basis to report an error? Prime example is in healthcare, where, for example, errors may actually be discouraged, not officially, but discouraged from being reported because of fear of litigation or some sort of retribution. So one of the critical things I think we need to explore even further is being able to get people, employees, on a bona fide basis to be able to say, you know what, I just made a mistake. And then not have the repercussions be that that you get a negative performance review, or that you actually are shown the door in many cases. So we really need to look at the culture of the workplace. There's the official culture that we all know of. Yes, we encourage people to report their errors and accidents or near misses, versus is that really encouraged or not? And this would lend itself to the other on the bottom, or yellowy orange side here, share stories and surprises. So are there opportunities during any sort of safety huddles or safety talks, or some of the things that happen in the context of the workplace, that we're able to share those stories and say, guess what, this happened to me, and I think, this is maybe some of the cause, and this is what we can do about it. Just like I delivered a talk yesterday to the interior designers of Ontario, and one of the things that I've recommended is that once they have finished the designs, it's often us in the ergonomic field who have to deal with any mistakes that may have been made in the design. We deal with it, but often there isn't a feedback loop. It doesn't go back to the original designers of software or a website or a building or a retail environment or industry. And in the absence of having that feedback loop, they never know that there may have been a mistake made in the design. And as such, they'll just keep redesigning the same thing. And then it'll be the human being that's often, again, blamed for that error. And then bringing the Humboldt bus crash and the accident that occurred with that, we have to think in terms of the cognitive aspects of the bus driver in this case. So we know that there were the physical aspects. Heather outlined how he got lost. And if you consider yourself and that you're trying to get somewhere on time, especially with just-in-time delivery systems, what has that done in terms of the cognition and the mental demands on drivers, any sort of truck drivers at all? Got to get the load there. There's a specific time. Now I'm lost. I got stuck in the mud. So you can think of what was happening with his physiology in the brain. Was he really able to focus on the task at hand? Was he thinking about the flap? He could hear it, he could see it in his mirror. So, from a cognitive perspective and mental demands, all of a sudden the mental demands were a lot higher than the task actually needed to be, leading, of course, to this tragic accident. So, again, we need to think about all of those other factors first before taking a look at the actual individual employee in terms of the error and sort of even the misnomer of human error. And one of the things that a designer recently quoted to me is that design dictates employee behavior. Just like in a retail environment, there can be subtle things that are done within a grocery store, for example, to try to lead us into the middle shelves versus the outer part of it. So design can influence behavior in a positive way, and it can also be used or result in more negative outcomes. So a prime example, of course, is all of us working from home. And how often have we said, Jane, your mic isn't on, or I can't see you, or even in the group chat here, I've noticed some people actually weren't able to hear the audio side of things. So is it because we often say, oh, I'm so stupid, I forgot that. Is it us, or is it actually the design? And is it the design being friendly from a mental perspective and cognitive perspective? Or is it the technology? Were we actually trained in how to use technology, Zoom meetings, and all of these new things that we had never heard of before? Did we receive education about it? Hey, this is going to be introduced. This is how it works. Did you get training? And also importantly, after training, what's often missing is, did people learn? And so more often training is now, yep, I went through all the slides, everything's good, I checked off, I did my training. Is anyone testing to make sure that learning occurred? And is that learning now been applied within a context of design and the workplace? And that is often a missing link as well. And I'll just close with these two really interesting and important quotes. Everyone, all of us, at some point in time, we're careless, we're impatient, we're complacent, we're just not having a good day. So as a result, we become distracted, we can become bored, we can become fatigued. And so occasionally we might take a chance, we might misunderstand something, we misread a situation, and these are completely human characteristics. And those characteristics must be incorporated into any design, be it product design, software, websites, workplace, etc. And the last slide that I'll finish with, I think there's one more quote. And because of the fact that we are human and we do have these traits, that are just a part of who we are, the equipment, the machinery, the systems, anything that is being designed must take into account the human factor. And that's where the science of ergonomics and human factors is critical in terms of each and every step that the design process goes through. So I'll now turn this back over to Heather, who will speak next.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jane. So some of you probably be familiar with what is on your screen. This is a Jenga block tower. Some of you may not be familiar with it. The goal of the game is to remove a block from any level of the tower without it falling over. The tower crashing down signals the end of the game. The person to remove the final critical block, causing it to tumble, is then jeered and pestered. But did the actions of that one person alone cause the tower to crumble? No. It was the result of the actions and decisions of those prior, leading up to that final block, influencing the stability of the tower. And in addition, it was the final person's actions. So from above, the system appears fine. The gaps, the weaknesses, the holes developed over time are hidden. This is often what company leaders see. And also true when the tower crumbles, analogous to incident is that there is a disproportionate focus on the person who touched it last. Their personality, their skills, behavior come sharply into focus. And why is that? Because the outcome didn't go as intended. On the one hand, removing a block, leaving the tower standing, invokes cheering, while the very same action causing the tower to collapse invokes discipline and often other penalties as well. So in the examples we've discussed today, adverse events are explained and rationalized often by the label of human error. However, this we know is a very simplistic explanation. The cause-effect relationship does not uncover causality, nor the myriad of system-level factors contributing to those holes and weaknesses and gaps that develop in the system. So going forward, we'd like to leave you with a message and the challenge to refuse those simple and individual component failures as explanations. Reject error as the cause, the sole cause of incidents. Rather than focusing on those disparate, separate individual parts of the system, including the people, the humans that do the work and the tools, let's shift to the focus on the system and the system interactions. Let's pull out our wide-angle lens to bring in focus the entire system and the interactions of the components, asking how and why those gaps may have developed before the people put maybe the final garnish, into the system. I like this quote by James Reason. So rather than being the main instigators of an incident, operators tend to be the inheritors of system defects created by poor design. Their part is usually that of adding the final garnish to a lethal brew already long in the cooking. So with that, we'd like to leave you with this message about offering appropriate levels of protection, designing a system that considers people on their worst day and not just their best day. Error is normal. We need to anticipate it, design for it, and when it comes, as it will, learn from it, leverage lessons to optimize life, well-being, safety, and performance. And now, with that, I'll turn it back over to our session chair, Jean.
So now that you know more about human errors and how small errors can collectively add up to catastrophic events, I invite you to be on the lookout for the human errors and the mishaps. Mishaps are very important because they're the little clues that can grow into something bigger. So the idea is really to communicate what you see and experience with the goal of improving the safety of all. In fact, that's how the pilots train. They train by learning from what other pilots experience and where the errors came. And those errors are sometimes fatal. So when you're in an airplane, you don't want to repeat an experience on certain things if you can avoid it. So you learn from other people and other people's errors. So that's very important. But what can you do, to help or to avoid human errors? Well, ask a lot of questions. So why did it happen? Or why did it not happen? What surprised you? What happened, to make the things a little bit less than regular, unexpected? So when you had a challenge, how did you cope with it? Were you stressed? Were you overwhelmed? And if so, learn from that and try to find a solution. And engage your company leadership and human factors, ergonomics. Understand the situation by placing yourself in other people's shoes, what they were seeing, what they were experiencing at the time. So we can help at Ergo at Large. Ergo at Large is a group of professionals and students who believe in improving life, well-being, and performance of workers and people across Canada. This is a pan-Canadian group. It was created following the desire to work collaboratively, not only within human factors, but across all disciplines that actually care about human and human activities. So we identified 4 gaps so far, and we're working actively on that. And today, that was the awareness of human factors and human errors for your benefit. This presentation was developed with the support of a team of people. So we had Nancy Black, Rizame Boob, Marilyn Provost, Era Padar, Jeff Wright, just to name a few. And also with the generous help of Norzaman Rashid and his team at CIEHF. Thank you very much for that. So at the end of the presentation, we will provide with a list of resources for further reading. And please reach out to us at Ergo at Large at ace-ergocanada.ca. So I hope this webinar will help you recognize and prevent errors in your daily activities. And so now we are open for questions. So I saw actually a question in the chat earlier. I thought it was interesting. It's do you have any advice on in terms of human errors and the effect of such restrictive procedures on good human attributes? Basically, what I think I understand it, it's like, okay, so to reduce human errors, sometimes you have to put strict procedures. Maybe Jane. So how can we do basically to not restrict creativity and still reduce errors?
So not restrict free activity?
Creativity.
Oh, creativity. Aha. Actually, that's an excellent question. Yeah, and I think there's I've got a good friend who's deeply involved in occupational health and safety, and as a consultant, and he's been finding that there's a movement away from having really strict policies and procedures, and that's often the function of human resources, where they keep writing and adding on more and more policies, and here's your procedure, and here's your standard operating procedure, and there's a movement to actually go away from that, still and instead to actually focus on the processes, but not what's in writing, but actually getting people to live and breathe policies, procedures, safety processes, and that can still allow creativity within a workplace. But the last thing we want is someone to be creative in terms of in the steel mill, where we do a lot of work, where there was always one employee who always said, look, I can run into that cutting machine that cuts off the band of steel, and it allowed that sort of, for lack of a better term, creativity, but it ended up loss of life eventually. So we want to balance having policies and procedures with actually getting the entire organization to live and breathe safe procedures, safe working methods, following the standard operating procedures. But I think it's really got to be throughout the workplace. So it still allows sort of creativity of thought, but at the same time, really preventing any sort of errors and accidents from occurring.
Yeah, great, Jane. I have a question for Heather.
Jean, just sorry to jump in. Before we jump to the next question, I just also I noticed the question that came in about safe work procedures that we've done quite a lot of work on. So on the one hand, Jane's pointed out, procedures can be good. They can be a standard for work and produce a framework for orientation and standardization. But on the other hand, over-reliance on safe work procedures to constrain behavior and to ensure safety has its troubles. So, in the question that was asked, they were talking about highly prescriptive tasks that might be involved in aviation. And it's interesting because in those situations, the safe work procedures themselves can be a source of error. So rather than adding in additional layers of safe work procedures to, as what was described, constrain the behavior and potentially add more layers of steps to follow, consider a couple things, looking at work as imagined, so what the procedure says versus work as done. There's always a gap between what happens in the field and what is expected to happen. And so if you can jump in to find out what that gap is, that can help. Number two is reduce the error at the source. So rather than layering on, more and more procedures to say, do this and follow these 10 steps, try to reduce the error at the source using a safety hierarchy, looking at elimination, in the first place, rather than the administrative protocols that come later on at the hierarchy. And with procedures, we also have to consider novice versus experts. So, when it comes to driving and learning tasks.
Heather, talking about that, novice to error to expert, we have a simple question. If you can answer that, that would help the rest of the presentation, which is, could you give a definition of error, mishaps? What's the mistakes? What's the difference? So I think it would be good to explain that right now for the rest of the questions.
Sure. So some of the earliest meaning behind error was it's a departure from the correct way. And the other thing that is key about mistakes, errors, mishaps is that they're unplanned, like they're not intended. And number two, that you only realize that they've happened in hindsight. So we started out at the outset saying that, they're unintentional, that there's error is not a choice, to err is human, some of these things. So you only know that you've departed from the correct path when, some other information has given you that indication. And so when it comes to the workplace, when it comes to lockout or following a procedure, you don't actually know that you've done the wrong thing until you have some form of feedback saying that, and sometimes the feedback sadly comes in the form of an incident, which is what, we've seen in some of today's examples.
Okay, so I have one maybe for Jane. So the question was about psychology as the focus or focal point of preventing error. How do you think psychology should be a focus point on preventing error or not?
I think it actually hasn't been involved enough, and given the fact that there's much more information now in thanks to the use of things like functional MRIs and more neurophysiology and neuroplasticity, now that the science is really well established there, I think that the whole area of psychology, neuropsychology actually should be more involved in terms of from design all the way to, as Heather was pointing out, procedures and people being properly trained and educated, et cetera. So it's been overlooked, but it definitely is required, and that's one of the missing links, I believe.
Thank you. And now I have one for Danielle. So there was some discussion in the chat about, how we have a system to report the errors, but sometimes the people are punished if they, because they reported an error, they made an error, so they're punished. Okay, what's your view on that?
This is a good point, because it's all part of the culture, and every single enterprises has their own culture regarding reporting. So that's another good reason why we need to talk about it today. We need to spread the words. to make sure that it will get to the point where more and more people will know it in the general industries and not just specialists like us. Because that's true that culturally speaking, there are some companies who are doing finger pointing at people when they report. So we need to tackle the cultural change. And it comes from education and awareness that needs to be raised. And unfortunately, I know it will stop individuals to report those events. But the more we report, the more we can fix things. So there's no right answer to say, I never want to encourage people to stop reporting. That's the opposite. But yes, that's true. We need to recognize that there's cultural challenges in companies.
So I have one for maybe open question. So they wanted us to comment on personality traits and their contribution to error. So what is the role of self-awareness for the person? So basically, if you're certain personality traits and their contribution to error, so that's one thing. Are they certain personality traits more prone to error? Like, for example, if you're more adventurous or more cautious, are you more prone to error? I don't know if we know about that. And
so I can kick us off. We want to stay away from looking at personality traits to mitigate error.
Thank you.
Thank you. We definitely don't want to go down that road. As we've said from the outset, error emerges from the intersection of work, people, and the workplace. So whether or not you have a melancholy personality or high energy, adventurous, or reading, that plays no role in error. I mean, we have to look at the context, and that's what we were saying, that errors emerge from and take place within a context. So with many catastrophic incidents, what has happened is there's been this disproportionate focus on the person who created the error, like what I was talking about with the Jenga tower, but particularly with Humboldt. There's been very little focus on the load, the truck, the road design, the pavement, the standing grove of trees. There was a disproportionate focus on the person, the personality. And that's often the case with other catastrophic incidents where we're having a tendency, because I think it's easy to say that you touch the path and you're, whatever the unfounded labels are out there, you're prone to error. So we use those as kind of an answer to stop the investigation. And it's really it creates a huge disadvantage because we don't get to advance safety when we focus on people's personalities.
Exactly. So each personality doesn't mean that because you're a certain type that you won't be in a situation where an error can occur. So we cannot really or blame human error on a certain trait of personality. It's too complex, That's the idea behind it. It's very complex.
And also the science, because thankfully, due to neuropsychology, neurophysiology, etc., it's finding that these are actually bogus terms and there's no science or evidence to back it up. So finally, we can sort of put that to rest based on good, solid evidence and then refocus on what Heather has described.
Okay, I have another one. How common is the use of information processing models to prevent human errors prior to product service implementation at work?
It's well established in the EU and Ireland and Australia, where the science of ergonomics and human factors and psychology are brought in at the start of design. In North America, sadly, because our skills and expertise are not brought in at the right time when things are being designed. That's why we're seeing more of these errors occurring in the context of our workplace. And even things, for those of you that have visited downtown Toronto and the path system, and people that regularly use it still get lost, it points to the fact that unless and until ergonomics human factors is brought in to sit with designers, any kind of designers, that we're going to still continue to see these errors and accidents occur.
Absolutely. And so in other countries I've seen it, but I don't think the models are there. They're not strong. I think there's an overly simplistic approach to events that happen, be them good and produce success, or be it if they produce an error. In some of the work that Dr. Akoff does that I've mentioned, he actually talks about two different ways of thinking: synthesis or analysis. In an analytic way of thinking, we pull the system apart. We try to understand how the parts work, and then we try to put the parts together, thinking if we know how the parts work, we'll understand the whole. And that's just not the case. So if we're looking at people, we have to look at the binding system that they're in. Or if we're looking at cars, we've got to look at the transportation system. We have to look at, if we look at education institutions, we have to look at the education system and try to understand the greater context, to understand the role of that thing in its context, so that we can understand how it plays a role and has influence.
Yeah. Are you back, Jean?
I noticed that in the chat that Karen Hoodless was talking about let's migrate away from human error, and instead let's go to if we must apply these labels, which I call that into question in the first place. Let's migrate away from human error, because it's not human error; it's system failure. So
very good.
I see a question from Laura McGuire. Can we talk a bit about how organizations can better understand their own work as done? Sorry, it's jumping around a little bit. As done versus work as imagined. Perhaps techniques or opportunities to proactively identify, not after the incident. So how organizations can better understand their own work as done. So I can open it up to the floor, but one way that one approach that we've seen some value in is looking at what goes well as in addition to what goes wrong. So having processes and places and practices that when things go well, we're asking the questions like, why did it go well? So we can do more of that. And I've also seen with wildland firefighting and manufacturing settings and other very dynamic settings, after action reviews. So if you are doing work and you've been presented with some surprises, debriefing after and asking, some questions like, how did that go? Were there any surprises? What, threw you off? Or what went better than expected? Understanding these, creating opportunities to share stories, to explore what went well versus what didn't go as was expected, can really help, I think, try to unpack or uncover those system elements and why things don't always go according to plan. So, Laura, those are just a couple of things that I thought you may find valuable as to why, or as to how we can look at that gap between work as imagined versus work as done, like how we can explore our own organizations.
So I have another one for everybody. So, and it's interesting, and I know a little bit about the answer, but it's all about individuals repeating the errors and as being a justification for penalizing them. And so it's very interesting, because repeating errors, it's probably not only the fault of the person repeating the error, right? That's what we're looking at today in detail. So there's probably a reason why the error is repeated. What do you think?
That's interesting because I know it's been covered in the presentation today saying that we are not making error purposefully. We all have good intention when we show up at work or when we show up wherever we go, we have good intention. We can expect to have good intention. So if someone is doing and repeating the same mistake again and again, that it just brings back the point that we need to feel comfortable and psychologically safe to report an error and a mistake to fix it, because we are not dumb. If we do mistakes again and again, it's because there's something wrong with the design, with the system in place.
Or the training, right? There's something wrong maybe with the training, or maybe the way the system works, so there's a lot of factors probably involved in a person repeating mistakes.
And I think Danielle said it well and popped it into the chat as well, that, we tend, in the wake of an error, we tend to look at the human condition, like, why were they thinking that way? When in fact, we need to look at the conditions that created or permitted the error to happen. And so, interesting with the Humboldt bus crash, there were 6 previous incidents at that intersection, 2 of which were major fatals. And so if we continue to have fatals and crashes, we have to ask ourselves what in the system needs to be changed. Like just constantly looking at the human cognition, whether or not we've had breakfast, whether or not we're drinking enough coffee, whether or not we're tired. Those are aspects that do need to be considered, but we also, in addition, must not overlook, be it the road system or the vehicle or the management practices, the work order, the time, the communication, and all these other factors. And I think if we are having repeat errors, that's a red flag for everybody. What do we do in the system to make those changes to stop it at the source?
Okay, so I think I don't see any other questions. So if I missed some question, please repeat it in the chat so I can see it, because there's a long list. Cannot see everything. So there was one more on the administrative part of it. So they want to know if it can certified attendance for this webinar, for some points for some association and things like that. So maybe Steve can answer that. So is it, are they going to receive a receipt that they actually attended?
Thanks, Jan, and thanks for the question coming in. We recommend that delegates claim the attendance within the way in which they compile their annual professional competence. So please note that you've attended this event. Also note what you've learned and how it's impacted the way that you do things.
He's coming.
It's not a question, but Gordon Helsley is making the point that Santayana said, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And going a bit further, I completely agree that if we're not learning from the errors and mistakes and leveraging that learning, there is the potential to do what we've been talking about, repeat the error. But I think another really good point to be made that's in line with that comment is, we sometimes learn and we do sometimes make changes, but I've seen many occasions where we take apart the system, we look at components individually, we maybe train an individual, we give them a better tool, or we turn on the lights, something that's small, discrete, and separate. It doesn't consider the interactions of the system. And so another thing following on what Santayana said is that, continuous improvement is also doomed to fail if you don't embed it in systems thinking. So if you're wanting to make improvement in the system, that's what you have to do. If you change the communication or dials or switches in a dark environment, you have to consider the interactions with other elements of the system. Otherwise, the improvement actually could create an error itself. It's just like the procedure comment. Adding in more procedures without understanding the value, the purpose, the goal, and all the complexity that safe work procedures can add can actually do detriment to the system rather than doing what is, what is hoped for, creating, fewer errors. So it's just an interesting point, and well said from Gordon.
So just to repeat, if people wants to reach us after, of course, you can go through the ACE, which is the Association of Canadian Ergonomists, but we are a subgroup which is called Ergo at Large. Ergo at Large, we are pan-Canadian group. So in the near future, we're focusing on Canada, but we're planning at the next EIA meeting, triennial meeting, to open it to a wider, more global audience. But you can still reach us at ergoatlarge at ace-ergocanada.ca. So if you want to talk to us, we're very open to that.
I'm just typing it in the chat to make sure that people will see it.
Yeah, I did too. That's good. It moves all the time, but seeing re-instruct the worker as the only preventative measure is frustrating.
Absolutely, Peg. Thanks for joining, by the way. I grew up in Sudbury, and nice to see you online. Very often with some of the incidents that we're seeing, even where you have people interacting with vehicles, you quite often see more procedures, as we've been talking about, but also signs. And we know that those things don't do anything to change the system. And in fact, they add a cognitive load, because now you have to see the sign and follow the instructions. And in a dynamic environment where you have vehicles saying, look this way or don't go here, it is actually counterproductive. So very good point, Peg.
And this is, I think, where us as an overall organization, that we need to really start to try to influence employers, and at the high level where, major decisions are made in terms of investing in ergonomics. I think that if we can all collaborate, which is what part of this is, then, we can start to become, working at the level that we should be, as opposed to, hey, Danielle, can you go out onto the shop floor and re-instruct that person and add a new policy or add a new sign, etc. Like really trying to get the science and what we do as a whole deeper into all organizations.
Excellent point. Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure the person understand the difference exactly between mishap and error and mistakes. So can you simply say it in a few words? So a mishap is something that could have happened, that didn't happen or was close to happen. Those are very important to report. People say, well, I just tripped on something, or I just dropped something. So it's a mishap, but that's always like a clue that something bigger can happen. So they're important. The mishaps are an error in the making. And then maybe, Heather, you want to make the difference, explain the difference between mistake and error in simple words?
Actually, if you go to Merriam-Webster or Google and you just type in error, you're going to see those words. You're going to see mistake. So mistake and error are interchangeable. And even a mishap is often used to describe an incident. So where an error it gets complicated because some of these words are all very interchangeable, and depending on, because we've perhaps put salt in our coffee. So that's not an incident. That would be an error. It's a mistake. And it turns out, virtually no consequences, or maybe just a minor inconvenience. But where the mishap label gets applied is when you have typically errors of larger consequence. So a mishap, like a misadventure, like with cranes, or with incidents, that's what they're going to call. And so when you have, the error now producing an unwanted or adverse event, typically the language does shift.
Hmm.
They said, alarm. Maybe there was an error somewhere.
And it's a feedback loop. Yay.
Mm-hmm. I think I see Sasho is saying that, to be honest, I think different bodies of research have possibly taken slightly nuanced approaches to mistakes and errors. I guess our approach has been at the 30,000 foot level, not to get into some of the grammatical or nuanced definitions, but that when you have, the intersection of the workplace components coming together, you get work. Most of the time it's successful, but sometimes it's unsuccessful, and things can go wrong. And when you have an error, our main point is not just to talk about the error, but is to understand how and why it happened by understanding the greater context and understanding the interaction of those workplace elements. Mm-hmm. Christopher, yes, getting into now we're getting into the weeds when we're talking slips, slaps, and mistakes.
Right.
Some are physical, some are cognitive. Yeah.
I can see that there's one hand raised. So Juan Limo. Maybe there's a questions to come, but his hand is raised.
I think Gordon sums it up nicely. Mistakes, errors, mishaps. If we leave the conversation at the person, blaming them, holding them solely accountable, punishing them, disciplining them, removing them from the workplace system without changing the workplace system, we've done ourselves a very big disservice. And we've done the person a disservice as well as the system, because if one person could do that slip or mistake or error and the system doesn't change, you can be almost rest assured it can happen again.
In a more catastrophic way too. And that's what we're saying, is sometimes very little things can add up if they're all, they can, a lot of little things can create a catastrophic event. So it's definitely not to be ignored. So try to not ignore those errors, report them, make sure that, and we can help at Ergo at large, but make sure all people report an error. And I know culturally we need to keep working on not punishing that. It's very important. Nobody in the health and safety or HR or anybody should come back with the punition. It should really be welcomed and put in a database and looked at. But there should not be any negative feedback for reporting an error.
But that's also why we need to talk about it more and more.
Exactly. So that's part of the cultural aspects to develop around that, around human factors in general. So we hear often that ergonomics or human factors are showstoppers, they don't create value, but it's the opposite. And we have many, many ways to prove that human factors ergonomics are really value added in all sorts of different ways. But we're going to continue to do webinars and inform, create papers and like panels like this one. So at Ergo at large, that's our role, our mission. So we want to pair students together from different disciplines, so all the disciplines can learn from it, not just human factors ergonomics, but agriculture, engineering, all the discipline that relates to human. That's what Ergo at large is. It's at large because we really englobe a lot of different disciplines, because humans are participating in some way or another in any discipline, whether it's for doing maintenance, to be an operator, any of these things. So there's always human participation. So we want to cover all these different disciplines.
So I just see another question by Fantz Comain. I'm just wondering about leveraging points. Perhaps would safety culture in general be a starting point for reshaping the discourse? And I want to say starting kind of more specifically will be producing the change that you want. So what I mean is, so if you're in a context of a working environment, and you know there are errors, you know some tasks or jobs or processes are more prone to error, and you want to do something about it. You don't go in at 30,000. Well, it's not ideal to go in at 30,000 and start, let's change the culture, and then we'll slowly trickle down to change the error. A more effective way would be to start with error reporting. Like, do you have processes and protocols where you can transparently report the error without reprisal? And then if you know about the report, about the error, then what's being done about it? Like, does it get just left unchanged, figure it out? Or are you actually making active changes? So over time, small incremental changes on communication and design, feedback, reporting, all of the principles that we laid out in the table that both myself, Danielle, and Jane spoke to, enacting those principles over time, even after a year, even 6 months, you will start to see a slow migration to increased transparency, increased trust, and a migration towards an overall more sustainable and safety, like a stronger safety culture that you're trying to achieve.
And on that, thank you, Heather. Thank you, Danielle and Jane. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And so that's going to conclude it. Thank you very much for attending, everybody.
Thank you so much, everybody, for all your comments and questions and contributions. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you to our audience. It's been a pleasure to host this webinar presented by the Association of Canadian Ergonomists. The Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors has been pleased to do that, and we hope you've enjoyed it. If so, please tell your friends and peers. Please, in particular, check out our website for the upcoming conference, Ergonomics and Human Factors 2022. That should certainly be on your horizon. That's being held 11 and 12 April online, 25 and 26 of April in Birmingham face-to-face in the UK. So please check out the Chartered Institute's website for further details of what's contained and how to book. Okay, thank you for joining us, our audience. So we had a large audience today. We look forward to seeing you again in the future on a further webinar. To our team of presenters, thank you to them. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.